about to tell you happened 3 weeks ago, and I still can't sleep without hearing that sound echoing in my head. The desperate cry of a baby that shouldn't have existed, in a place where no child should ever be found. My friends and I discovered something in those woods that night. Something that's been hunting families in our town for decades, leaving behind empty cribs and broken hearts. And if you've ever heard a baby crying in places where babies don't belong, then you need to listen to every word of this story, because what we experienced could happen to anyone who's brave enough or foolish enough to follow that haunting sound into the darkness. The baby we found wasn't a baby at all, but something far more sinister that's been using the most primal human instinct, the need to protect a crying child, to lure people deep into the forest where they disappear forever. And the three of us barely escaped with our lives from something that's still out there, still crying, still hunting for its next victim. It started as an ordinary Friday night when my friends Jake, Sarah, and I decided to take the old forest path home from the late movie, a shortcut we'd used dozens of times before, without incident. But tonight felt different from the moment we stepped off the main road and into the tree line. The moon was nothing more than a silver crescent, barely visible through the canopy of ancient oak and pine trees that seemed to lean inward like they were trying to block out the sky. And our flashlights created dancing shadows that made every tree trunk look like a waiting figure, and every branch like reaching arms. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since we'd entered the woods. Our breath came out in visible puffs that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have, creating an almost supernatural fog that swirled around our feet as we walked deeper into the forest. We were maybe half a mile in when the sound first reached us, faint and distant, but unmistakably the desperate wailing of an infant somewhere in the darkness ahead. We all stopped dead in our tracks because we knew there was no possible explanation for a baby being out here at midnight, us from the nearest house, in a part of the woods where even experienced hikers rarely ventured after dark. The crying wasn't constant. It came in waves, starting as a soft whimper that gradually built to a full-throated wail before fading back into silence. And each time it returned, it seemed to be coming from a slightly different direction, as if whatever was making the sound was moving through the trees just beyond our vision. Jake wanted to turn back immediately, his face pale in the flashlight beam, as he reminded us of all the missing person reports from this area over the past few years. But Sarah argued that if there really was a baby out there, we had a moral obligation to help, and I found myself caught between common sense and the overwhelming urge to investigate. The sound was heartbreaking, the kind of desperate crying that triggers every protective instinct in the human body. And despite every horror movie I'd ever seen warning against following mysterious sounds into dark forests, I couldn't shake the image of a helpless infant abandoned in a cold wilderness. As we stood there debating, the crying suddenly intensified, becoming more urgent and distressed, and it was moving, definitely moving, in a pattern that seemed almost deliberately designed to draw us deeper into the woods, away from the safety of the path and toward whatever was waiting in the heart of the forest. Against our better judgment, we found ourselves following the sound of flashlights cutting through the darkness as we pushed through undergrowth that seemed to grow thicker and more hostile with every step. With each step we took toward the crying, the forest around us seemed to transform into something alien and threatening, as if we were crossing invisible boundaries into a realm where the normal rules of nature no longer apply. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their branches forming a canopy so thick that our flashlight beams seemed to be absorbed rather than reflected, creating pockets of absolute darkness that could have hidden anything. The ground beneath our feet changed from the familiar crunch of fallen leaves to something soft and spongy that seemed to pull at our shoes with each step. And more than once, I felt something that might have been roots, or it might have been something else entirely wrap around my ankles before I could pull free. The crying continued to guide us, always staying just far enough ahead that we couldn't quite locate its source, close enough to keep us moving forward through terrain that became increasingly difficult to navigate. Sarah pointed out that we'd been walking for almost 30 minutes and should have reached the other side of the woods by now. But when we turned around to look for the path we'd been following, there was nothing but endless trees stretching back into darkness, as if the forest had somehow rearranged itself behind us to prevent our retreat. The crying was getting stronger now, more distinct, and underneath it, we began to hear something else, a low humming sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, a vibration that we felt in our bones rather than heard with our ears. After what felt like hours of stumbling through the increasingly hostile forest, we finally emerged into a circular clearing that shouldn't have existed, a perfect circle of bare earth surrounded by trees that stood like silent sentinels, their branches reaching toward each other overhead to form an almost cathedral-like dome. In the center of this unnatural space sat an antique wooden crib, painted white but stained with decades of weather and neglect, and it was rocking gently back and forth despite the complete absence of any wind. The crying was coming from the crib now, clear and unmistakable, the desperate wailing of an infant that seemed to echo off the surrounding trees and come back to us from all directions at once. As we approached with trembling hands and pounding hearts, our flashlights revealed details that made my blood run cold. The crib was carved with symbols that looked like they belonged to some ancient religion, and the wood itself seemed to pulse with a dark energy that made my skin crawl. The blankets inside were rotted and stained with substances I didn't want to identify, and scattered around the base of the crib were small objects that looked like toys at first glance, but revealed themselves to be something far more disturbing when examined more closely. Tiny bones arranged in patterns that suggested ritual and sacrifice. The crying reached a crescendo as we stood there frozen in terror, and then suddenly, without warning, it stopped completely, leaving us in a silence so absolute that we could hear our own heartbeats echoing in our ears like thunder. In the sudden silence, we could hear our own ragged breathing and the sound of our hearts hammering against our ribs. But there was something else, a soft, rustling sound coming from behind us, as if something was moving through the undergrowth at the edge of the clearing. When we turned our flashlights toward the sound, we saw it, a small figure crouched in the shadows between two massive oak trees, its body twisted and wronged in ways that hurt to look at directly. At first glance, it appeared to be a child, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, wearing a tattered nightgown that might once have been white, but was now stained with mud and something darker. But as our eyes adjusted to the sight, we realized that this thing had never been human at all. Its limbs were too long and bent at impossible angles. Its skin was the color of old parchment and seemed to hang loose on its frame, and where its face should have been was nothing but shadow, punctuated by 2 points of pale light that might have been eyes. The crying sound was still coming from this creature, though its mouth never moved, and as we watched in horror, it began to slowly unfold itself from its crouch, revealing a height that was far too tall for its apparent age, with arms that reached almost to the ground and fingers that ended in what looked like claws. Sarah grabbed my arm so tightly that her nails drew blood, and Jake was backing away so quickly that he stumbled and nearly fell. But I found myself frozen in place, unable to look away from this impossible thing that was clearly the source of the crying that had lured us so deep into its domain. The creature tilted its head at an angle that would have snapped a human neck, studying us with those pale points of light that served as eyes. and then it smiled to expressions so wrong and predatory that it seemed to transform the entire clearing into a hunting ground where we were nothing more than prey. The crying sound stopped abruptly and was replaced by something far worse, a low, throaty chuckle that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep in the creature's chest, a sound that spoke of centuries of successful hunts and countless victims who had followed that irresistible baby's cry to their doom. As the laughter grew louder, the trees around the clearing began to sway despite the absence of any wind, their branches reaching down toward us like grasping fingers, and the ground beneath our feet started to vibrate with that same humming sound we'd heard earlier, now revealed to be some kind of summoning call. Other shapes began to emerge from the darkness between the trees, more creatures like the first one, but in different stages of decay and transformation, all of them moving with that same unnatural, predatory grace as they formed a circle around us with the empty crib at the center. Jake broke first, turning to run toward what he thought was the path back to safety. But the moment he reached the edge of the clearing, the creatures moved within human speed, cutting off his escape route and driving him back toward the center where Sarah and I stood frozen in terror. The largest of the creatures, the one we'd seen first, began to approach us slowly, savoring our fear. And as it drew closer, we could see that his nightgown wasn't stained with mud at all. It was covered in the dry blood of previous victims who had answered the call of that crying baby in that moment of absolute terror when death seemed certain and escape impossible. Something deep in my brain kicked in, the same survival instinct that had kept our species alive for thousands of years, and I grabbed Sarah and Jake and screamed at them to run, not toward the blocked paths, but straight at the smallest of the creatures blocking our way. We crashed through the circle of monsters like football players breaking through a defensive line, the claws raking across our clothes and skin as we fought our way past them. And suddenly, we were running through the forest faster than we'd ever run in our lives. Our flashlights forgotten as we relied on pure adrenaline and desperation to guide us through the darkness. Behind us, the creatures gave chase, and their pursuit was like nothing from this world. They moved through the trees like shadows, sometimes running on the ground, and sometimes seeming to float through the branches above us, their haunting cries echoing through the forest like a pack of wolves closing in on wounded prey. Branches whipped at our faces, and roots tried to trip us with every step. But we didn't dare slow down, because we could hear them getting closer, their inhuman laughter, mixing with that terrible baby's crying sound that now seemed to come from everywhere at once. Just when our lungs were burning and our legs were about to give out, we saw the most beautiful sight in the world. The lights of the main road, cutting through the trees ahead of us, made me burst out of the forest like swimmers breaking the surface of a lake, gasping and sobbing as we collapsed on the blessed asphalt of human civilization. When we looked back, the forest was silent and still, showing no sign of the nightmare we just escaped. But we all knew that somewhere in those dark woods, the creatures were waiting for the next group of curious victims to follow the sound of a crying baby to their doom. We reported what happened to the police, but they found nothing. No clearing, no crib, no evidence that anything unusual had ever occurred in those woods, and the missing person reports we mentioned were dismissed as unrelated incidents spread across several decades. The three of us agreed to never speak of it again, to try to convince ourselves it had been some kind of shared hallucination brought on by stress and darkness. But deep down, we all knew the truth of what we'd encountered out there. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep without checking my windows and doors multiple times, and every sound in the night made me freeze with terror, waiting for that familiar crying to begin again. Sarah moved to another state within a month, claiming she needed a fresh start for college, but really running from the memories that haunted her dreams, and Jake started drinking heavily, trying to drown out the sound of that inhuman laughter that still echoed in his head. But the real horror began 3 months later, when I was walking home from work late one evening and heard it again, faint and distant, but unmistakably the same crying sound that had lured us into that clearing, coming from the abandoned lot behind my apartment building. This time, I didn't follow it, but I knew it was following me. And every night since then, the crying has gotten a little closer to my bedroom window, a little more insistent, as if the creature knows I escaped once and is determined not to let it happen again. Sometimes I catch glimpses of a small figure standing in the shadows across the street, watching my building with those pale lights where its eyes should be. And I know it's only a matter of time before it decides to stop waiting and come for me directly. The baby's cry has become part of my life now, a constant reminder that some things in this world are better left unexplored, and that curiosity isn't always rewarded with answers. Sometimes it's punished with a lifetime of looking over your shoulder and wondering when the hunting will begin again. If you ever hear a baby crying in places where babies don't belong, in empty buildings, in dark forests, in the middle of the night when you're alone, don't follow the sound. Turn around, go home, and pray that whatever made that crying hasn't noticed you yet, because once you've heard it, really heard it, it never truly goes away.